For my second YouTube tutorial, I'm showing how I painted the Black Armour on the Skulldread. We're going for quite a warm, interesting, deep black. I'm using AK Black and AK Intense Pink. I've experimented with lots of recipes for highlighting black, and this is one of my favourites that I'm using at the moment. It creates quite a warm black by mixing the intense pink in with the black in gradual sort of stages. You can create nice depth, and it particularly works well when I'm doing OSL lighting on a project, especially if I'm using a purple or an orange or anything like that, because it just creates a lot more depth and more realism to the reflections. So starting off with my mix of black and 1 part pink to sort of 3 parts black, nicely diluted down about 3 parts water to 1 part paint. I'm gradually using my chippy short brush stroke style to sort of build up some highlights and build up some tones and textures around the corner of the model where the light's probably going to be at its strongest. Doing these little chippy brush strokes really adds texture, and if you keep the paint nicely diluted, then they all blend together really smoothly and it doesn't just look rough. And at later stages we also bring in some glazing as well, which smooths things out even more. So now I've added a little bit more pink into the mix, and I'm focusing my chippy little brush strokes on the corner, on the edge where the light's going to be at its strongest. But as you can see from the video, as soon as the paint starts to dry, it becomes less obvious. It sort of tones itself down a little bit. So you just keep building up more and more layers, adding more and more of the pink in, and gradually getting to the point that you want. So by keeping all these brush strokes random and quite light, but also quite short, sharp and sketchy in a way, you're building up a texture that emulates a bit more of the roughness of the armour that you might get from years of battle. I'm trying to focus most of my short brush strokes around the corner for the lighting, but occasionally I go out into the blend, the outside edges of the tone change, to just create more subtlety to that blend and add more interest in terms of battle damage. So we've added more pink in, and again we're getting brighter and brighter on the outside edge. I think about now it's starting to get past the point I wanted it to be, so what I'll do is I'll mix up some black in a glaze consistency, which is 1 part paint to 5 parts water, and then start to just blend it in, tone it down, and just soften some of those transitions. So you'll see from the glaze consistency when it goes on the palette, it's very, very thin to the point you can still see through it quite nicely. And that means that whilst it will take quite a few coats to cover, it will give you much more control and subtlety in that transition. And I'm focusing the glaze around the shadows, the natural darker points of the armour, and other points just to increase the contrast and make it more interesting as a piece. You'll also find that once the chippy brush strokes have dried, they often look pretty smooth, but you might use the glazing just to smooth things out a little more and just make it all look a little bit neater and more finished. And as you can see, with a few coats of glaze already, the extreme highs of the black-pink mix is much softer and less eye-catching, which is what we were going for. So now with a slightly thicker glaze mix, I'm just really working on the edges and softening that transition as much as I can. If you were painting just for a gaming standard, you might not want to do too much glazing and just keep the higher contrast, rougher finish. But if you're painting for a display standard or for a competition, you might want to spend a lot longer on this stage. The sky's the limit really, how long you want to take just to smooth out that transition. But the good thing is, if you keep building up those layers, you end up with really subtle changes in the colour, and you can really tweak how dull or how bright the individual highlights appear. So now I'm going to leave that black armour as is and start working on the non-metallic metal steel. I'm going for a dark steel on all of the trim and edging and those little studs on the leg armour. My go-to for this model was black, decap blue and off-whites to create a nice cold dark steel that really complements the pinky black armour. By going in a different direction with the highlights on that, you're not risking any visual confusion as to what's the black and what's the steel. So going with a very small amount of decap blue mixed in with the blacks created this nice cold dark grey, and I'm gradually starting to build out the high points on the metal trim and define what the sort of overall look of the armour is going to be. Now, I always like to imagine that the light is coming from sort of above and to the left of the model as I'm looking at it, which means the higher points facing that are going to catch more light and thus be brighter. But at the same time, you also want to think about reflections and where they're going to come. So you will have your high point at the top left, but you'll also have a reflection at, for example, the bottom right where it's bouncing back off the floor. You also want to add the odd extra highlight, even if they're not in the most naturally occurring areas, just for visual interest and to define certain pieces or details in the armour. So now I've added more decap blue and I'm picking out smaller areas and increasing the contrast on the highlights. One of the main tricks with non-metallic metal is making the transition from the extreme shadows to the extreme highlights in as short a space as possible. It creates more of an illusion of shiny metal. If you spend too long in the mid-tones, you just end up with a dull thing that doesn't look like metal. So on that part of the armour you can particularly see there's a black still around the stud, the rivet, that I'm keeping as black as I can whilst transitioning into that decap blue mix as quickly as possible. Now more decap blue into the mix, and again focusing on the high points, the studs, the rivets, the things that are actually catching the light, and the pieces that we want to be obvious from a distance when we view the model. And once we get past a certain point of the black and decap blue mix, we tend to add in a little bit of off-white because it just helps to pick out the light sources and really make that transition into the brighter highs, which sell the effect of the non-metallic metal clearer. By keeping all of my layers to a quite dilute sort of 2:1 water paint ratio, they blend in nicely with the previous layers, and because we're using the same paints and the same palette, everything comes together quite cleanly and not too obvious where your brush strokes are. But even if you paint in quite a choppy style and you do end up with a texture from brush strokes and different paint marks, it can just add to the effect of battle damage, or especially on metal, it is rarely going to be smooth and clean. So now with more off-white, we're just picking out those high points, the edges of armour panels, doing some fine edge highlighting with the edge of the brush just to pick out the little details that would be lost on such a small dark piece of the model. And again, more of the off-white going into the mix. You can see quite clearly through the wet palette how we've transitioned, and we've still got evidence of each layer across the palette. So if we need to go back and change something or add in an extra high paint or a mid or a low, we've still got that paint available. And we can also grab any of that and turn them into glazes ready to smooth out any rough transitions or add any interest into different areas of the trim. So sometimes we add additional highlights or edge highlights, in this case on the bottom edge of that trim, which might not be technically accurate because you're not going to have a bright light source coming from below. But what this does is clearly defines the edge of this trim that we're working on and just makes it less visually confusing. And it's a little bit of a trick to highlight every single edge when you're doing non-metallic metal, because metal is just naturally reflective, and capturing those hard edges with a little bit of a brighter highlight just really makes the effect more convincing. So now again, with more of the off-white in the mix, we're almost at pure off-white now. We're just touching the very high points, the edges of the armour, the rivets, any sharp points that are pointing towards our light source. So now the non-metallic metal trim's starting to look good, we can start looking at doing some battle damage. And the nature of my short brush stroke choppy style on this piece, it gives you lots of quite obvious parts that could be battle damage. So what we tend to do is we look for where there's clearer lines, where there's clearer brush strokes, and then essentially highlight them, shade them, and embrace that they're there and use them as battle damage. So what I've done is I've used a black, quite dilute 2:1 water to paint, and I've just added shading or shadows to these points that are going to be battle damage. And now using a pink mix, again quite dilute with a very fine pointed brush, I'm just highlighting the underside of the battle damage. Essentially what that's doing is the dark point looks like a void or a crack or a scrape in the armour that's not catching the light and creating a shadow. And then the high point, the pink, is showing the hard edge on the outside of the crack that would catch the light naturally. That's basically it for all the techniques that I would use during painting the black and the non-metallic metal silver. But all of these stages you can just invest as much time as you want and just keep going with glazes, additional highlights, boosting the contrast, and just keep going back and forth until you reach something you're happy with. I recorded quite a few of these videos during the painting of the Skulldread, so subscribe and like and come back for more if you're interested.